Hello. Today we're going to cover off the first part of the section on strategic planning. So ultimately, the purpose of strategic planning and the various different models that we'll cover over, um, you essentially have to figure out what is it that you're trying to do, what is it that you're trying to be. And it really starts off with that core strategic piece. In the weekly materials, there's a brief little video that gives a description of what is strategy, because it's a word that has been misused an awful lot, and it's become a buzzword certainly in the last 10 or 20 years, to the point where I think often it's used in circumstances that really don't resonate with its true meaning. So there's several key pieces about it, right? So it's forward looking. So it's aspirational. It's kind of where you're going. It's longer term in focus, right? Usually from a business standpoint, this is 5+ years out. Often it can be even longer than that. It talks about how you're going to get somewhere, things that you're willing to do, things that you're not willing to do, because there's more than one path usually ahead. You need to have figured out your strategic vision before you go through any planning, because ultimately your plan is about how do I achieve that. It's a way to translate this vision of what we see ourselves as and where we see ourselves going into actually creating that reality. So start with your strategy, define what you are and what you're trying to become, and then your plan, regardless of the way you approach the planning process, is ultimately about figuring out what kinds of things do we need to do to get to where we're envisioning ourselves going. And it will be a series of actions. You'll have to have measurements, because how do you know what success looks like if you haven't been able to measure it? If you're, how do you know whether you're making progress if you don't have measurements for it? So the kinds of things that you'll measure, what those objectives are, and the ones that you pick have to be things that will certainly demonstrate whether you're achieving that strategic vision that you're looking for. Typically, your strategic planning happens at least three levels. It starts strategic, which is usually the top of the organization, and it's much farther out and broader and more encompassing. As you start to translate that into today and some of the things we do over the next series of months or years, you start to develop more of a tactical plan. So how will we actually do these things? And one of the things you'll see is that this cascades through an organization. And as you cascade from one level down to another, it becomes more and more tactical or even operational. And operational, obviously, here's the last one. It's the actual day to day. And in each kind of distinct area, there's different things that happen, right? Strategic kind of lays out the high level. Tactical is, how do we make this work in the current environment? And then operational is when we're actioning these things day to day, what kinds of changes do we have to make to the things that we're doing to keep us on track? Because ultimately, we're still trying to get to that place that we see ourselves going to, and follow the kind of path that we're trying to go. But you know what? Sometimes there's things that happen that cause you to have to make mid-course corrections. So the analogy I usually give for this is, in many ways, a strategic vision is about where you are now and where you're trying to go. So if I'm here now and I'm trying to go to London, England, I would have to figure out how is it that I might actually get there, right? So I probably, in assuming I could fly these days, which I think would be difficult to do, but assuming I could, I would have to book flight. I would have to travel from Kitchener-Waterloo, probably to Pearson, which is the international airport just on the outskirts of Toronto. I'd probably get a flight from Pearson. There are direct flights from Pearson to London, but I'd have to pick the airline and all that other stuff, and then I would have to go through doing this. Well, you develop that plan to realize the future vision of where it is that you're trying to go. It's very common as you start to try to do it. Like, I'm trying to go to the airport, and there's wicked traffic on the 401. which is the major highway between us here and there. And I'm unable to get there at that point in time. So it takes me 3 hours longer than I thought it was going to. And by the time I get to the airport, like the flight's already gone. So what do I do now, right? So then you have to figure out, well, what do I do now? Well, I'd look to see if I can get on the next one. Does Air Canada have another one? When do they have it? Maybe I fly another airline. Maybe I can fly from here to another airport to connect to be able to get to it, right? And you start making alterations. You're still after the main goal of where you're trying to go to. It's just that the path that you take may end up changing. And that happens fairly commonly operationally because things change and you have to make adaptations based on those changes. So here's an overview kind of the planning cycle. And I think contrary to popular conceptions, if you're like a C-level role in a larger organization, right? So CEO, CFO, any of those other things, you spend most of your life in some kind of a planning cycle. That's a large piece of what your role in that organization is. So you're either getting ready to plan, examining some of the inputs from the various different environmental input pieces, and we'll kind of look at those in a little while. Looking at alterations to maybe mission or vision, kind of depending on how things are unfolding in front of you, and you're always working on some element of the planning cycle. Now, we're going to look at a few different examples. This is by no means an exhaustive list. And in fact, there are an infinite variety of ways to essentially come up with a business plan. And some of them suit some circumstances better than others, right? So just to give some examples. The first one we're going to talk about is Hoshin. So Hoshin planning is common to traditional Japanese quality organizations. And Hoshin planning starts with a vision, which most do. There are guiding principles or values, which is basically kind of the how we'll do things. And you define your mission. And this, if you put all of these pieces together, in many ways, this is the constancy of purpose, if you will, that Deming had been talking about, right? Because it's not solely about, making money. It's about what we're willing to do, right? So purpose is delight our customers by delivering a quality of service in a cost-effective manner through the contribution of everything. Then you go, okay, where are we now? So you need to figure out where are you from these different aspects, right? So how do customers rank you, suppliers, kind of where do you fit in the marketplace? And then what's the gap between where you are now and this future vision that you see? And then what kinds of steps do you think you have to make to get there? So you would have multiple strategic goals, and they would span over various different years, because and part of it would be figuring out which things have to be done first, and then you figure out what kinds of, in order for that to happen, what do the various different functional areas of the organization have to do, and when do they have to do that in order for this stuff to work? And then it kind of iterates its way down. That overall is not an uncommon approach. What is uncommon about Hoshin and other organizations is it's a much more broader concept of planning. Instead of being something that largely happens at the senior level, it actually is something that the entire organization is involved in doing. It works great if you happen to have that kind of an organization and you happen to have that kind of a culture. It is very inclusive. And one of the great things with inclusivity is that people tend to support the things that they're part of creating. So you have fewer issues with employees being on side. And in addition, because they were all involved in the creation of it, everybody knows where it is they're going and what that top looks like. So you don't get the kind of fragmentation that you often get in Western businesses and under other methods of planning. So it's a great communication tool. It reinforces the teamwork, but the broad involvement that's required if your culture isn't already that way, would be, almost overwhelming for you to be able to do. So works great in that circumstance, wouldn't necessarily work great in some other organizations. Okay. The next one we're going to look at is a scenario planning one. So scenario planning is all about envisioning a variety of different kind of what ifs as part of your planning process. And part of it is to try to avoid the tunnel vision that can happen sometimes. Sometimes you kind of key in, early on, you kind of key into a particular path. And as a result, you kind of don't see some of the options on the periphery. So this tunnel vision can sometimes happen, and scenario planning kind of forces you out of that space, because although that might have been the first inkling that you were going down, you'll go, okay, well, that's one. What else might happen? Like what other future could potentially be in place for us? I think this is a really good approach if your business is one where there's some very significant um, susceptibilities to what success looks like for you that you have no control over. So the example I usually talk about for students has to do with if you're in the oil business. The price for a barrel of oil will have a huge determinant on what you can do and what you can't do, and it will have an enormous impact on what your business will look like. And you have absolutely no control over what it is, right? So we've just gone through a period of time where the price of oil has dropped dramatically, right? It's driven by COVID-19 things that are going on, but still, the net result is, it's plunged that industry into a huge recession, and there's all kinds of activities that no longer can proceed along. So what you would do in scenario planning is you would come up with several different storylines, if you will, right, about potential future conditions. You usually have a good case, an expected case, and then like a bad case. Sometimes you might do a wild card. Hey, if this happened, right? So in the oil thing, the wild card might be, the introduction of some radical new power source that would completely negate the internal combustion usage, right? So if somebody launched a hydrogen fuel cell that just like totally knocked it out of the park, that would completely transform what that business would look like, right? So that could be a wild card one. So you look at a bunch of different options, and then ultimately you're going to pursue the one that seems to be the most realistic, or the one that seems to make the most sense under the current situations. But usually what happens is because of the fact that you've looked at multiple different ways of going, as part of your adopted plan, you'll also figure out inflection points where you may start to implement a different plan, right? So I may start to go to the upside, or I may start to go to the downside based on circumstantial changes that I see. Now, you wouldn't go back and forth with any great deal of movement, but if there was something very significant and longer term that had changed, you would make that change. So, currently, if you had planned in the oil business, it was already having some challenges from a pricing standpoint. And then as soon as the pandemic hit and it started to spread, for sure that the next 2 years are going to see a serious curtailment in the use of fuel. It's going to be cut down pretty dramatically. It will vary regionally. There'll be some regions that'll be more harder hit than others, and the consumption will change in some regions more than others. But overall, it's going to reduce quite a bit. That's going to have significant repercussions on the refining capabilities and the usage and efficiency of those capabilities. It's also going to have some serious cash flow implications for businesses in that industry. And I think there's probably really good reasons to believe that the usage pattern may never recover from what had happened previously, because we were already in an era where there was more and more push towards looking at alternate sources of propulsion and other ways to fuel, if you will, transportation and other parts of our economic sphere. And there's lots of reasons to believe that as we come out of the pandemic, a couple of years hence or so, that you may never see those patterns come back the same way, right? So they may have been pursuing along a path that was kind of the accepted one, and then when this started to go down, they may have started to pivot, right? And frankly, if I was responsible for planning and bidding the oil business, I would be very much probably trying to find a way for me to be um, in the power and fuel business without it being oil, right? I'd be looking at other forms of power and other kinds of propulsion systems and supporting that. And I'm sure the major players have been. I would be pivoting pretty hard in that direction, I think, under the circumstances. So regardless of how you choose to plan, right? And those, we just talked about a couple of examples. There are lots of other ways that you could approach it. And in fact, um, the approach that you take to be successful to some degree will be a product of the environment that you're in. If you're in a very dynamic environment, the kinds of ways that you plan have to be different, and they have to match the fact that it's a very dynamic space. If the space that you're in is not that dynamic, there's other things you potentially can do, regardless of how you go about doing it. The fuel for planning is information. And basically, the information has to come from the environment around you, that you need to be able to look at what's going on. What's going on now? What do we think will potentially be happening in the future from all kinds of different angles, right? So you may do a SWOT, right? And we'll spend a bunch of time going through that. It's a tool. SWOT stands for strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats. It's an assessment tool where you look at your strengths and weaknesses, and then you look at the opportunities and threats in the world around you. And between all four of those elements, you try to come up with what are some of the best things for you to do in the circumstance you find yourself in now. Okay, so it's one of the tools that you would use as inputs to your planning. You're also going to look at market forces, competitive analysis, benchmarking, and we'll spend some more details about these as we get going. You'll also probably have a part of the process where you're doing some stakeholder evaluations. Stakeholders are significant groups or populations to your business, your organization. So examples of stakeholders are customers, suppliers, employees, communities that you operate in, things like that. Those are all kinds of stakeholders. You're going to look at technology and duality, right? So there's technology about the products and services we deliver. And then there's enabling technologies about how we run our businesses or things that we can do or how we can do those things. You're also going to look at your internal capabilities. So what is it that we can do? Because a lot of future opportunity comes out of doing something that you're not doing now. But in order for you to be able to do that, you have to have the ability to do that. So you need to understand what are your internal capabilities, because you very likely have abilities to do things today that you're not exercising on. And then ultimately, are there any legal or regulatory implications? And this will change dramatically depending on what business you're in, right? A lot of smaller businesses, the legal regulatory piece of it is very kind of health and safety focused, right? So if you have a local restaurant or you have a salon or a retail store or things like that, there's not a lot of legal or regulatory outside of the health and safety kind of stuff, right? So, practices for cleanliness and things like that. And there's a whole bunch more that just got added because of COVID-19. But again, they're all in that space. There are other industries where the regulatory involvement is much more significant, and some of the legal implications are much more significant. And one of the other things that happens in both of those spaces is you want to look at the trend. So is it becoming more in my industry? Is it becoming less in my industry? You probably can't change it. It's probably going to be whatever it's going to be, but you need to understand where it's going because you're going to have to respond to those changes.